Thanks, Noel. I'm delighted to be here. So let's just start right away. The FPA certainly is a tremendous institution, and I've been delighted to be affiliated with it for a long time. And this World Leadership Forum also is extremely important, particularly this panel. And I think everybody on the panel would agree that we think that climate change is one of the most urgent issues for world leaders today. We've got three very distinguished guests today, and I'm going to first introduce them. We're going to have a couple slides from a few of the panelists. We'll probably have a conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A and then have some closing remarks. I think everybody has the bios, so I will do very short introductions, and I'm going to start immediately here on my right with Stephen Cohen. Stephen is the executive director of the Columbia University Earth Institute, which I think everybody's familiar. It's a very prestigious institution on this issue. He's also an author and a professor on sustainability, environment, and management. And to his right, we have Nat Cohan, who is the vice president at Environmental Defense, and he leads their international climate change program and also used to be in the administration working on environmental issues. And finally, we have Dr. Cindy Parker, who is a physician and author also, and she's on the faculty at Johns Hopkins in the School of Public Health in the Department of Environmental Health and Sciences, and she also directs the Global Environmental Change and Sustainability major. So we're going to start right on the top of the subject, which is about climate change. Actually, the subject is mitigating climate change, investing in sustainable development. And I think it's always worth everybody to sort of understand the baseline of where we are with climate change and how urgent the issue is. So we've asked Cindy to start with just a couple slides to put it into perspective from a health point of view. So Cindy?
Okay, yes, my job is to communicate why we need to worry about mitigating climate change. So I'm going to show you a very brief 30-second video, but I want to explain first what you're going to see because it's going to go by very fast. So this scale down here tells you this is in degrees Celsius. So if it's white, there's no change. And if it's yellow, it's about a half a degree Celsius increase in temperature. Orange is 1 degree and red is 2 degrees. And so what we're looking at is the difference from what we would expect, what the average would be. The difference from that is what we're looking at, not absolute temperature. And so just to sort of give you an idea of why we think that this is an issue that requires mitigation. So we're starting in 1884. We're now at 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, and 2012 then is here at the bottom. So the difference and so far we've experienced about 1.5 degrees, 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit of increase in global average surface temperature. And you can see that that's had a tremendous effect already. We're not talking about into the future, already. And hopefully that made some impression on you because I think it's really obvious. 2012 is the hottest year on record in the United States. And then why is a physician talking about climate change? So that she can fix herself when she breaks her neck, falling off the podium. The reason why a physician is talking about climate change is because climate change is not really just about plants, penguins, and polar bears. It's also about people. It actually provides tremendous threat to human health and well-being. And so I've created this slide based on what I think are the most important to least important things. So I've actually put the least important things at the bottom, the most important things at the top. And usually if we're talking about climate change at all, we're talking about things like heat stress and greater risk of infectious diseases, especially those carried by insects. Those are absolutely true. We'll see an increase in those, and they will be significant. Worsening air quality is another big effect. We know that air pollution causes people who have heart and lung disease to get much sicker, to die much more quickly. We also know that it can cause normal, healthy people to develop lung diseases and heart diseases. So worsening air quality, also a big health risk. Rising sea levels, and particularly what goes with that is an increase in things like storm surge, extreme weather events, and we've certainly seen that right here in the US as well as all over the world recently. More environmental refugees, threats to global security. I'm going to show you a brief example of that. And then here's where I think we're really need to have significant concern. Threatened food supplies and water supplies, and then also the potential for ecosystems that are just stressed beyond the point where they can continue to provide us with the services that we depend on from them. So with all of our fancy medical technology, we still have not yet figured out how to live without clean air, clean water, and something we can recognize as food, and we rely on ecosystems to provide those things for us. So food supply, I mentioned, is one of the main things I'm worried about. These are some of the things that keep me awake at night. There have been some studies done, and actually there are some great studies going on at the Earth Institute right now, and we're actually building on that as well at Hopkins with looking at how climate change will affect the entire food system. This is some very limited studies who have just looked at increase in crop yield. So it's likely that what we actually would see, I mean, it's likely that this is an understatement, but even this is significant. So we're looking at least a 2°C increase in global average surface temperature, and that's if we really get on top of this thing. It's unlikely that we're going to be able to keep that less than 2 degrees. So that would be 10 to 20% decrease in global food supply by, also remembering that we're going to be adding roughly 1.5 billion people or 2 billion people between now and 2050. If we don't get this thing under control and we're looking at 3 to 5 degrees increase in centigrade, then we're looking at really huge hits to the global food supply. Here's another thing looking at precipitation. So let me sort of orient you here. Precipitation change, the lightest color is no change, and the darkest green is an increase, and the darkest orange is a decrease in precipitation. This map at the bottom is June, July, August. That map up there, December, January, and February. The stippling indicates the amount of agreement between the climate projection models. And one thing you'll notice is that there's actually a lot of agreement about this area right here. And so those of you who are interested in security, and I think we probably all are interested in security, this is trouble. I mean, this is an area of unrest that is likely to get much drier, already dry, likely to get much drier. And also the United States is implicated there as well. And so just an example of how this can play out. So looking at Syria, these are Vegetation Health Index for the last roughly 10 years. So red is bad. Red means really bad season. And you can see that Syria is always sort of on the edge. But in 2007 and 2008, they had a really bad season where pretty much their entire wheat crop in particular was wiped out. And that meant that you had like 75% of households with total crop losses having to sell off their livestock because they couldn't feed them. Because there's a glut of livestock, then they sell their livestock and don't get much for it. They have no more viable farms, so they move into the cities. And you can sort of see where this is going, I think. So that's the end of my slides, and hopefully that has helped to communicate some of the urgency and to just bring home the message that this is really a health issue, not just an environmental issue.
Thank you, Cindy. I think that's a key point, that this is not just an environmental issue. And I think Nat now wants to share a little bit about maybe how he sees it as an economic issue.
Sure, and the first slide is going to look a little bit like some of the slides Amy put up, but I want to bring away a couple of very specific messages, and then I have another slide that will bring closer to home. And thanks very much, Amy, for having me on the panel, and thanks to the Foreign Policy Association for hosting this event. So this slide, the map looks a little bit like some of the maps that Amy just put up, and it's showing a couple things, and I want to tell you what I think the three takeaways are. So what is it showing? Well, over land, it's showing this in two futures. Okay, the top future is a world in which we limit the increase in global temperature to about 2 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees Fahrenheit. That's like the best outcome we could hope for. This is by the end of the century. The bottom panel is one in which temperature rises by 4 degrees Celsius, about 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And what this is showing is it's simultaneously showing over land what happens in terms of temperatures and in particular extreme heat events, and over the ocean what happens in terms of sea level. And you know, it's hard from the back to see the numbers, although you can see the increased shading in color. But this is saying, in terms of the modeling, what this is saying is, you know, we often think, well, 2 degrees Celsius, that doesn't seem like such a big deal. You know, after all, if it, you know, 4 degrees Fahrenheit, if it's kind of 70 degrees out or 74 degrees out, you think maybe that's not such a big deal. But what that means is that every day is shifted up and the whole distribution of temperatures is shifted up. And so that the hottest day that we have now in summer becomes a regular day or even a cool day in the future summers. And what these maps are showing on land is how likely is it that a summer day at the end of the century is warmer than any summer day we experience now. And what you're seeing in the bottom is all those orange and red areas, it's 60, 70, 80%, 90% likely that a month in the summer in the northern hemisphere is warmer than any month we have now. It's warmer than a 1 in 740 years. So think of the heat wave we had in this country last year. Think of the heat wave that Europe had in 2003. That's the new normal in that bottom world. In terms of sea level rise, what we're seeing is a meter of sea level rise in many places. That's 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. That's an enormous amount of sea level rise. If you think that, you know, we've already seen a few centimeters, and on my next slide, you'll see what that has meant for us. So these are huge implications. What are my 3 takeaways from these slides? Because there are 2 worlds after all. One of them is, if we end up in that bottom world, we are in big trouble. And it's not just polar bears and, you know, ice caps, it's human development and it's the human economy because of the kinds of impacts we're seeing. That's number one. Number two is that we still have a chance to make things better because we still have a chance to get in the top world, which is a 2-degree world. We can argue over whether we can all go the way there or most, but we still have a chance to avert the worst impacts that we see in the bottom of the slide. And the third message is, even if we do the best we can, there's going to be climate change, and we need to start thinking about how to adapt to it. So all 3 of those messages come out of this slide. Let me see the next slide. The next slide is, this is a picture, probably many of the people in the room can identify it. This is Hurricane Sandy. And the reason I put this slide up is because lots of the discussion about climate change and a lot of discussion we may have is about what happens at the end of the century, what happens in 2050. But we are already seeing the impacts of climate change now. Can we say that Hurricane Sandy wouldn't have happened without climate change? That's hard, and that's a discussion, that's a debate among scientists. We can say that the sea level has risen enough that the storm flooding and the surges were worse than they would have been. And we can say that this is the kind of thing we'll see more of in terms of extreme events if we don't do anything about the problem. So that's how I would frame the urgency, not only in terms of the end of the century, but in terms of what we're seeing right now here in New York City.
And can you sort of elaborate on that, or is there a way to say it instead of this is what we're seeing now, this is what we're paying for now? And maybe Steve, you want to respond?
I'm sorry, what do you mean by paying for now?
That because of
I mean, we're
hurricane,
still trying to fix things afterwards, sure.
right? The cost implications.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of interest. You know, I've seen all of these slides many times at the Earth Institute as well, because we have 700 people working on this all the time, and the idea that somebody's actually questioning the facts of climate change is like questioning gravity. I mean, it's really an absurdity that we're still having this conversation. And I know we have to, because not everybody believes it, but it's coming and it's here now, and we are paying for it. New York City's just proposed a $20 billion climate resiliency plan, and that $20 billion is $20 billion that can't be spent on schools or on homeless shelters or a whole variety of other things. Because you know, going to school isn't that useful if you're underwater. So the point I guess I'd make about all of this is that we live in a society and an economy based on fossil fuels. The lights in this room, the projector, all the way that we live requires these things. And so we should have a sense of urgency about moving from a fossil fuel-based economy to a fossil fuel-free economy. We have the ability to do this. We know how to develop technologies. We know how to do this kind of work. Some of these technologies are already in place. They need to be perfected. Things like using nanotechnology to make smaller and more cost-efficient solar cells, better batteries, doing the kinds of things that we ought to be spending a lot more time and effort doing, because this is ridiculous. We're not going to be able to, that second map that you just saw is coming if we don't get off of fossil fuels. So now the interesting thing about this, I mean, today President Obama released the two new regulations on new power sources for new power plants, not existing power plants, to regulate them for climate change. It's the first climate change regulation we've seen at the national level. It still has to go through several years of litigation, and I'm counting on my friends in your operation to help make sure that gets protected. But there's two approaches to this problem. One is to raise the cost of fossil fuels, which is what, in essence, a carbon tax will do, which is what a regulation is. Or, and I think this is the one that I think is more promising, we figured out a way to lower the price of renewable energy. And the analogy I'm always using is computers. When I was in graduate school, I know it was a long time ago, I had a computer that was probably the size of one of these rows of seats, and it had less computing power than this. And why can't we figure out a way to power our society without using fossil fuels? There is absolutely no reason to do that, and we have to make that a global priority in our thinking and our work. And if we do that, we can avoid some of the impacts of climate change, because I think what my colleagues here have just said is it's already here. And one of the points is that the greenhouse gases that are in the upper atmosphere, they're staying there, and they're there now. And we're seeing the impact of some of them already. Now, scientists, because they deal with probabilities, can't say factually this causes this. But they can definitely say that the probability is higher because of these kinds of events. Now, we live in a world of probabilities, and if something's risky, you don't do it. I live across the street from Morningside Park. It's a beautiful park. I don't go there at 2 in the morning. It's reasonably safe, but I don't go there. 2 in the afternoon, anytime. So why are we walking into this climate world that we can avoid? We can avoid it if we get a little smarter. So I think a lot of our conversation has to be geared up toward first getting people to understand the urgency of this problem, and getting them to accept it, and to understand that our economy requires us to make this transition. It's not just the $20 billion of cost that we're talking about for resiliency. It's the fact that, let's put it this way, they're not making more fossil fuels. That's why they call them fossil fuels. They're not getting easier to get out of the planet. It takes more effort, costs more money, okay? Even with greater technology, it's getting more expensive, creating more damage. Ask the people in BP what they think about that idea. So we need to figure out a way to lower the cost of energy, because everything that we use in our households requires energy. Our whole way of life requires energy. And so if we don't figure out a way to get off of fossil fuels, we are in deep trouble. I think that should be the focus of policy development in this area.
So Nat, do you want to jump in? I mean, clearly there has been quite a death knell for coal recently. Obviously today's announcement for the new source performance reviews, but also some of the comments that the World Bank has made in terms of not financing coal-fired power plants in development, except for in extreme cases.
Right, and I think we can get into the topic of investment maybe in a little bit and talk about how shifting patterns from investment in coal and investment in fossil fuels to investment in renewable energy and what that means for sustainable development and sustainable investment. I just wanted to come back really briefly on something that you said, Amy, and that you said, Steve, which is the cost, the economic impact of this storm and sort of this photo, because we often talk about it in terms of heat waves and health and so on, and those are critical aspects of cost. But it's also, Steve, you mentioned the $20 billion resiliency fund. I think the cost of Sandy was estimated at $60 billion. When you throw in the costs of the drought in the Midwest, last year's extreme events, the bill for last year's extreme events was $100 billion. And if you start paying $100 billion just in one country every year, the bill starts to add up. And I think a lot of, in the past, a lot of the discussion when Steve or someone like us, we say, well, gee, we need to make this transition to renewable energy. People say, oh, well, how much is it going to cost? And the reality is that what we're doing now is costing a huge amount. And so when we look at it through that lens, I think that's what we need to keep in mind, is that the cost of inaction looms over all of this discussion.
No, absolutely, and it just compounds the problem. So, Cindy, maybe you've got a couple comments in terms of the impacts. I know you gave us a good overview, but the impacts on sustainable development and how climate change is basically have the potential to undo a lot of the development that we've achieved in the 20th century.
Well, you've actually just summarized that point very well. Let me just add also to the economic piece of this from the health standpoint. There was just a study that came out of MIT that shows that about 200,000 people die prematurely in the U.S. So we're not talking yet about the developing world. In the U.S., 200,000 people die prematurely every year. So that has an economic cost associated with it. And so that actually makes air pollution actually one of these sort of win-win situations, at least from a number of perspectives, in that if we clean up our air, we get immediate health benefits. We get immediate lives saved. We don't have to wait for some time in the future to see those results. And so there are possibilities for these kind of win-win situations in terms of sort of no matter what you want to count. And with sustainable development, you're absolutely right. I think for part of the reason why I'm talking so much about the U.S. is because I think Americans tend to think climate change is something that's going to happen to those people on the other side of the world in 100 years. And we seem to be sort of united in the desire to bring home the point that it's happening now and it's happening right here as well. But certainly those people on the other side of the world are going to suffer even more greatly and more quickly in many ways than we will. And so, yes, we have the financial ability to recover from a big disaster like Sandy. And it takes up, a relatively small amount of our GDP. When you compare with an extreme event in a developing country, it can take up 60% of their GDP to try to recover from that. And obviously that doesn't happen. They don't recover from that.
Just on this point, and maybe I can just have the next slide, I think, speaks to this point, because the World Bank has been looking at this issue of how climate change affects development in particular. And these pictures are from a report they just released in June. They show temperature and precipitation patterns for sub-Saharan Africa on the left and for South Asia on the right. And you can tell from the color scheme that things look terrible under the 4-degree world that I mentioned. But the focus of that report is what happens to agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa? What happens to water resources and agriculture in South Asia? What happens to fishing and fisheries and coral reefs and water and sea level rise in Southeast Asia? Because Jim Kim, and I've got a quote up there from Jim Young Kim, who's the president of the World Bank, I think in looking at this, coming in with fresh eyes to the bank and to this issue, and seeing the evidence mounting, he said, you know what, the role of the World Bank is to eradicate poverty and to promote shared prosperity, and we can't do that without addressing climate change. So if we're thinking about sustainable development, thinking about the other side, the sort of other areas of the world, someone like Jim Kim, I think, has come to this and said that we can't lift populations out of poverty unless we address the climate issue. And all the work that's been achieved over the past 50 years to do that could get undone if we have a future world in which the agricultural productivity and the water resources are undermined and threatened in these areas.
Let me reinforce the point about water and food, which is that 70 to 80% of the fresh water that we use goes to agriculture. And so that's where you see the first impact of not just shortages of water, but degradation of water. And so, in fact, we have a number of people studying the interrelationship between climate and water and food, and it's one system. And as I think you mentioned at the very beginning, we're biological creatures, and we actually need, I guess you said this, water, air, and food. You know, you can be very rich or very poor, but you need all three of those things or you're not around. And so it's a sort of equal opportunity assault if we don't figure out some way to solve it.
No, exactly. Maybe we'll just move a little bit to the short-term versus long-term issue. I mean, all of you have touched on it, but here we are with a huge, you could say, economic problem on how we solve climate change as we start investing in these mitigation strategies. But of course, we have urgent needs in front of us, from poverty, education, and the list goes on and on. I mean, what are some of the ways that we can begin to address that or help folks see that the long term is absolutely necessary? The long-term investments are absolutely necessary.
Well, let me start off with one idea, which is, you know, there's, we've been doing a fair amount of thinking of this lately at EDF, and you referred to the issue of coal financing before. I think there's a set of needs when you're thinking about development, and whether it's, you know, development in emerging economies or places like sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, or frankly, whether it's, you know, continued economic growth in the U.S., the fact that our model has relied on a kind of high carbon pathway doesn't mean that it has to rely on that going forward. And so I think the challenge, it's not to say, you know, stop, no more progress, no more economic development. The challenge is to say, and the opportunity is to say, well, here's the low carbon path to make investments that not only provide access to fresh water and provide access to transportation services and heating and cooling and energy, but do that in a way that doesn't heat the planet. So, for example, a great example on this is in energy access. 1.2 billion people in the world, or some, I think 1.3 billion lack access to energy. That's a critical need that needs to be filled, but we have a choice whether to fill that with coal-fired power plants, which will undermine the development by creating this sort of future, or to do that with renewable energy and with cleaner forms, if we have to go with cleaner forms of, you know, cleaner forms of traditional energy rather than conventional coal plants. So let's use wind, let's use solar, let's use distributed generation, let's use natural gas if we have to, but let's get off of the traditional conventional coal that we've been on. And maybe the next slide can provide a little bit of basis for that discussion, which just shows patterns of investment in renewable energy since 2004. I think this slide has a couple of interesting takeaways. One is the overall amount of investment has been rising very steadily, and then it actually fell off last year. And the sum of these two bars, the dark bar is developed countries, the light bar is developing countries. So the overall development hit a peak in 2012, and that was partly because of things that went on in Europe and the US and so on. You see investment in developing countries, China, India lead the way, has been steadily rising. And so I think that's a positive story and a good news story here in terms of providing those services, that energy access, but doing it through sources that are not going to worsen the climate problem.
Well, let me make the point that it's not an option not to develop in the developing countries. And this is not just an economic fact, it's a political fact, which means that everybody who doesn't have what you have sees what you have. There are now almost 6 billion cell phones on the planet. Most of them are smartphones. And we know people that we work with in Africa and the Earth Institute that they're not on the grid, but they have phones. They get them charged once a week. They communicate with each other and with the rest of the world. And they can see the same video images that are transmitted everywhere all over the world. So they know how you live. They know how I live. And they want it. And it's a political fact of life that it's coming. And it's either going to come in a way that's going to help the planet develop sustainably, which I think we've just heard the way you do it, or it's going to come in a way that's going to destroy the planet utterly and cost a lot more in health and everything else. It's not just climate, actually, because, you know, keep in mind, when you burn fossil fuels, it affects climate. But when you get it out of the ground, it destroys ecosystems directly. You don't even have to wait for the climate impact. It happens right away. Go look at some mountaintop removal in West Virginia. You'll have a sense of what I'm talking about. So this idea that somehow there's an option that we can keep doing it the old way, you know, that in order to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. This is just not the way it's going to happen. And so, you know, in the United States, I worked in the Superfund Toxic Waste Program in the 1980s. This country has spent between $500 billion and $1 trillion cleaning up the toxic waste from the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. Half of that was, by the way, in military lands and federal lands. You know, that's largely done. We've done most of what we can do in that area. You know, China is just beginning to learn the impact of rapid economic development. You know, I have Chinese students coming to study with me at Columbia, and they're desperate to do something about yellow air and green and red rivers. And it's not an option. So I think this idea that somehow the old way of doing business has a future, whether it's in terms of investment or anything else, is simply not the case. It doesn't stand up to a test of reality.